They thought it was frozen soup. Then one of them took a spoonful, and started laughing. The summer heat in Georgia had a way of pressing against the skin until even breathing felt like work. It was July 1945, 2 months after the war had ended, though the men behind the wire hadn't quite learned to believe it yet. The camp lay just beyond a line of cornfields, its wooden barracks sun-bleached and splintered, its air thick with the smell of diesel, damp laundry, and the slow rot of waiting. By midday, the ground shimmered. The German prisoners, stripped down to undershirts, worked in the field under the eyes of a few American guards who looked just as exhausted. The war was over, but the habits of it lingered, the counting, the shouting, the invisible line that separated the us from the them. When Sergeant Tom Brown came walking up the path carrying a dented metal container, most of the men stopped to stare. He was a solid figure, red-faced, his sleeves rolled high. The metal box hissed faintly, condensation pooling along its sides. "Lunch, boys," he called. His voice was dry, almost teasing. American style. The translator, a young corporal who'd studied German before the war, repeated the words. A few of the prisoners exchanged glances, puzzled. One of them, a lanky man named Franz with a sharp jaw and tired eyes, frowned. "Es ist Sup, Jeffrin?" he asked. "It's soup, frozen." The others chuckled uncertainly. The box was opened with a metallic pop, and a wave of white mist rolled out, cold and sweet, cutting through the heavy heat. Inside was something they'd never seen before, pale, soft, and shining in the sun like snow. Brown grabbed a spoon and took the first bite, his grin half mocking, half proud. "Go on," he said. "Ain't poison." Franz stepped forward slowly, spoon shaking in his hand. He dipped, scooped, hesitated, and tasted. For a heartbeat nothing happened. Then his face changed. The muscles around his mouth twitched, as if they had forgotten how to move that way. And then he laughed. A sharp, sudden laugh that startled everyone. "Mein Gott," he said between breaths. "It's sweet." The sound broke something in the air. Within seconds, others moved closer. One after another, spoons scraped against the metal sides. Laughter spread like wine through tall grass. Men who had once loaded artillery shells now jostled each other for a second bite. Brown leaned against a fence post, watching them. "Guess they never had ice cream," he muttered. "Not like this," the corporal replied. "They grew up on war rations." One of the older prisoners wiped his mouth and looked at Brown, eyes squinting in the glare. "What is this?" he asked in halting English. Brown smiled. "Ice cream." The man repeated the words slowly, tasting them as carefully as he'd tasted the dessert. "Ice, cream." Franz laughed again. "Freedom tastes strange," he said. The guards chuckled. For a few moments, there was no language barrier, no rank, no guilt, only men standing in the sun, savoring something cold and ridiculous in the middle of a Georgia field. Someone started humming. It might have been a song from before the war, or before any of them had become soldiers. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. When the bucket was empty, Brown kicked at the grass with his boot and said, half to himself, "Ain't much, but maybe it helps." That evening, the event made its way into the camp's daily log. The clerk, a schoolteacher before the war, wrote in tidy script, July 18, 1945, unscheduled distribution of frozen dessert to POW work detail. General morale, improved. Behavior, exemplary. But there was another note, scribbled in the margin later by an unknown hand, strangest thing I've ever seen, men who tried to kill us, laughing like children. That night, long after lights out, the guards could still hear quiet conversation through the thin wooden walls, German voices repeating the new English word over and over. Ice cream, followed by bursts of laughter muffled under blankets. Tom Brown sat on the barrack step, smoking in the dark. Fireflies drifted above the wire. He thought about his brother, killed in France, about the bitterness that used to fill his chest whenever he looked at the men inside that fence. But tonight, something had cracked, not forgiveness, not yet, but a strange, small understanding. The war had ended on paper months ago. But out here, in the middle of a summer too hot to remember who hated who, it ended again, quietly, absurdly, with a spoonful of melting sugar. No one knew that an officer's report would later call the moment insignificant, yet notable. No one knew that it would be filed under miscellaneous events, July 1945. But that entry would become something else entirely, the first recorded instance of laughter shared between enemies on American soil. They just called it the day the war melted, just a little. And somewhere in that silence after the laughter faded, the first drop of peace hit the dust and disappeared. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. One guard said later, they looked like kids who just saw snow for the first time. That evening, the air above the camp was thick with the smell of dust and cooked corn. The sun had sunk low behind the trees, painting the barbed wire in orange light. The heat was finally breaking, and for the first time in weeks, the prisoners lingered outside the barracks without orders. Some sat cross-legged in the dirt, their boots unlaced, shirts open at the neck. Others leaned against the walls, humming softly, the sound carrying like a lullaby through the camp. From the guard tower, Sergeant Tom Brown watched them in silence. He wasn't used to seeing them laugh. Usually, they worked and slept with the same empty stares. But tonight was different. They were passing around a battered harmonica, playing something slow and uncertain, a melody that might have once been German folk or maybe just something they were making up as they went. The notes were off, but the feeling was right. Below, one of the younger guards nudged his elbow. "They're human after all," he said quietly. Brown didn't answer. He just nodded, eyes still on the men below. Later that night, in the small chapel tent near the fence, the camp chaplain sat at his desk writing in his diary. He recorded everything, as if the war could be made sense of one sentence at a time. The entry for July 18 read, "Remarkable event. German POWs enjoyed ice cream. Laughter, honest, pure. Almost human again." He paused, tapped the pen against the page, and added, "Strange how mercy can travel through something as small as sugar and cream." Across the yard, Brown sat outside the guardhouse with a letter in his lap. His handwriting was clumsy, the paper smudged from sweat and dirt. "Dear Mary. You wouldn't believe it if you saw it. Those men we've been watching all summer, today they laughed. I mean really laughed. It sounded like kids back home when the ice truck comes down Main Street. They're just men, honey. Not monsters. Just tired boys with hollow eyes. Maybe the war burned out everything but the hunger for something sweet." He folded the paper, but before sealing it, he added one more line, "Maybe the war's ending, piece by piece, right here." In the barracks, the prisoners were still awake. Someone had found an old deck of cards missing half the suits. They played anyway, using pebbles as bets. When the lights-out whistle blew, they ignored it for a minute longer. The guards didn't stop them. Franz, the man who'd laughed first that afternoon, sat by the window with two others, talking in low voices. He was a baker before the war, he said. The others leaned closer as he described flour, yeast, the smell of dough rising in a warm kitchen. "It feels like another life," one of them murmured. "Like it belonged to someone else." Franz smiled. "Maybe it's time to borrow it back." Outside, Brown leaned against the fence, watching them through the gap between posts. He saw one man gently tapping the table, keeping rhythm with the harmonica. Another whittled a spoon from a splinter of pine, running his thumb along the smooth edge like it was something precious. The moon came up pale and sharp. Fireflies blinked between the rows of wire, their light catching the metal and making it seem almost beautiful. In the morning, the prisoners went back to their work detail, hoeing the dry soil behind the mess tent. But something in their movements had changed, not faster, not lighter, just present. They spoke more. They shared cigarettes. They greeted the guards without lowering their eyes. The camp had a new nickname by noon. One of the cooks had scrawled it in chalk on the kitchen board, the ice cream unit. Everyone started using it, half joking, half proud. Even the colonel in charge signed a requisition slip that way. A week later, Franz approached Sergeant Brown while the men were cleaning buckets behind the mess hall. He hesitated, wiping his hands on his trousers, then spoke in careful English. "Sergeant, the men, we want to learn to make ice cream ourselves." Brown raised an eyebrow. "You? With what, exactly?" Franz shrugged. "We'll find a way. We just want to try. To remember." Brown laughed, shaking his head. "It's an American thing." Franz smiled faintly. "Maybe peace is an American thing too. But we can learn that, can't we?" The words hit harder than they should have. Brown said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded toward the supply tent. "If you can find something that won't poison anybody, be my guest." That night, after the guards had turned in, a small group of prisoners gathered under the dim light of the mess hall. They had a rusted bucket, some milk from the kitchen, and the stubborn will to do something that wasn't about survival or orders. Brown watched from outside, arms crossed. Through the window, he could see their faces, serious, almost reverent, as they argued over measurements, argued over nothing, and kept stirring. He smiled despite himself. The war had taken everything from them, but here they were, trying to make dessert. In his letter home, Brown added a final paragraph before folding it for good. "They call it peace, Mary, but it's more like a memory learning how to breathe again. Today they asked to make their own ice cream. I told them yes. Don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to see if joy can survive behind a fence." The next morning, the first light broke across the camp like something new. Inside the barracks, laughter echoed again, quieter this time, but real. And out in the yard, the same metal buckets sat waiting, packed with ice, milk, and hope. Because tomorrow, they would make their own. They had no machines, no sugar, and no idea what they were doing, but they had a will to remember what happiness felt like. August 1945 came heavy and wet, the air thick as syrup. The war was ending everywhere. Japan's surrender crackled through the camp radio one humid evening, but here in Georgia, peace still felt like something half-learned, fragile and shy. The cornfields had turned gold, cicadas screamed from the trees, and behind the barbed wire, a strange kind of anticipation stirred. The prisoners had been granted permission to make ice cream. An experiment, the colonel called it in his report. But to them, it felt like something more sacred than that. They gathered behind the mess hall at dawn, sleeves rolled, faces still pale from too many months indoors. The Americans brought what they could, a few metal pans, a cracked barrel, and blocks of ice wrapped in burlap. No sugar, only condensed milk, a splash of vanilla, and a handful of salt from the kitchen stores. Franz directed them like an orchestra. "Slow," he said, turning the spoon through the mixture. "Too fast, and it won't freeze." One of the younger guards, curious, leaned on the fence and asked, "You really think that's gonna taste like the real thing?" Franz smiled without looking up. "Nothing tastes like freedom," he said. "But maybe this comes close." They worked for hours, their shirts sticking to their backs. When the ice began to melt, they replaced it with what little was left from the kitchen's cold storage. Someone started humming, not the dark marches of the army they'd once served, but an old children's song. The tune caught and spread. The guards watching from the yard traded glances. The sound wasn't defiant, just human. Inside the mess tent, Sergeant Tom Brown lit a cigarette and watched through the window. The prisoners were laughing now, their hands white with frost. "Guess peace tastes like vanilla," he muttered. One of the cooks, stirring a pot nearby, chuckled. "If it holds together." It did. Barely. When they finally scooped it out, soft, uneven, melting faster than they could eat, the men lined up with bowls fashioned from tin cans. No one spoke at first. They just tasted. And then the silence broke. Someone laughed, that same startled, honest sound from weeks before. Then another joined. Soon, the whole yard was filled with voices, rough and bright, echoing against the wooden barracks. Brown stepped outside, shading his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he said under his breath. Franz turned, holding up a dented bowl. "For you, Sergeant." Brown shook his head, smiling. "You made it. You eat it." The men insisted. One even climbed halfway up the fence to hand it over. Brown hesitated, then took it. The cold bit into his fingers. He tasted, and for a moment, the years fell away. It was crude, too salty, almost sour, but somehow perfect. "You're hired," he said. The laughter that followed rolled through the camp like thunder after a dry spell. Later that night, in the camp's official log, the chaplain added a line in neat handwriting: August 9, 1945, POWs organized ice cream day. Morale, highest since capture. Below it, he scribbled one more note: strange to see the enemy singing lullabies while the world surrenders. But for those inside the fence, the world had already surrendered, to something better. When the sun went down, the men stayed outside, watching the last light fade through the wires. The air smelled of milk and salt and wood smoke. Someone strummed a guitar, another clapped along. A few of the guards joined them, quietly, pretending it wasn't against regulation. It was Franz who broke the spell. He stood up, holding the empty bowl, and said in slow, careful English, "Tomorrow, maybe we make more. But not for us." Brown frowned. "What do you mean?" "For the children," Franz said. "The ones who walk by the fence every morning. They stop and stare. Maybe they should taste peace too." The yard fell silent. Beyond the wire, the road to town shimmered in the dusk. Every morning, a few local kids wandered past on their way to the schoolhouse, watching the men in the fields but never speaking. Brown's cigarette burned low between his fingers. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the humid dark. "Children, huh?" he said finally. Franz nodded. "Yes. They don't care who we were. Only what we give them now." No one answered. The cicadas screamed louder, drowning the quiet for a moment. Inside the guardhouse, the camp radio crackled again, news from the Pacific, the voice of a president declaring peace. The words bled through the static: "The war is over." But outside, between wire and fireflies, a new kind of silence took hold, the kind that comes just before something extraordinary. Because the next morning, one of the prisoners would walk to the fence with a bucket in his hands. And what he would ask for would change the camp forever. They came with wide eyes and empty hands, and the prisoners offered them the coldest, sweetest peace. Sunday morning rose over the camp in a hush so complete it felt rehearsed. The sky was washed pale, the air soft with the smell of wet earth and milk. Church bells from the nearby town of Aliceville drifted faintly through the trees. Beyond the barbed wire, the fields shimmered with dew, and on the dirt road, a line of children appeared, farm kids, barefoot or in scuffed boots, led by curiosity more than courage. They came often to stare at the Germans behind the fence. To them, enemy was a word grown-ups used. The men inside looked less like soldiers now and more like scarecrows in patched shirts, sweating under the Alabama sun. Usually, the guards waved the children away. But this morning, something was different. At the main gate stood 6 prisoners, each holding a dented bowl filled with melting ice cream. They had worked through the night to make it: milk, salt, a bit of sugar borrowed from the kitchen. The guards watched but didn't interfere. Brown was among them, arms crossed, pretending not to care. The children stopped a few feet from the fence, whispering to each other. One small girl, maybe 7, with a ribbon slipping from her hair, tilted her head. "Mama, can I?" she asked. Her mother, standing farther down the road, stiffened. "Annie, no," she called. "Get back here." But the girl didn't move. She looked at the man holding the bowl, a tall, blond prisoner with a kind face and hands rough from work. He crouched down slowly so he wouldn't frighten her. Dyke, he said softly, then, realizing she didn't understand, added in careful English, for you. He extended the spoon through the gap in the wire. Annie hesitated, eyes wide. Then she reached out, took the spoon, and tasted. Her whole face changed, confusion, surprise, and then joy. She giggled, a bright sound that made everyone, even the guards, turn to look. Ice cream dotted her chin like white freckles. The other children pressed closer. The prisoners passed spoons through the fence, one after another. Laughter replaced the morning silence. The adults on the road stayed frozen, unsure whether to pull their children back or just watch. The blonde prisoner smiled faintly, his voice trembling as he said, "My daughter is your age." Then he stepped away from the fence, wiping his eyes with the back of his wrist. His name was Walter Hoffman, a former engineer from Hamburg. He hadn't spoken of his family in months. Brown stepped forward, his tone gentle but firm. "All right, that's enough," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. The children lingered, waving. The smallest boy called, "Thank you, mister." And Walter laughed softly. "Bitch Sean," he said, almost whispering. By noon, the bowls were empty and the ice had melted into the dust. The guards herded the prisoners back inside, but no one shouted. The wire gleamed in the sunlight, clean and quiet, like it had been reset somehow. That afternoon, a local photographer came by the camp with a small camera. He'd heard the story from a farmer's wife. He wasn't allowed inside, but he stood by the road and snapped a single picture, children laughing by the fence, Germans smiling behind it, sunlight turning everything gold. 2 days later, that photograph appeared in the Aliceville Times under a short headline. Yesterday, German prisoners shared ice cream with local children. For a moment, no war, no fences, just laughter. People in town argued about it. Some said it was indecent, fraternizing with the enemy. Others clipped the article and pinned it to their refrigerators. The church pastor mentioned it in his sermon that Sunday. "Mercy," he said, "is not weakness. It's what makes peace possible." Inside the camp, morale lifted like a breeze after weeks of still air. The prisoners talked about the children constantly, how small their hands were, how they reminded them of home. They saved bits of sugar from their rations, whispering plans for another Sunday. But peace, like ice cream, melts fast in the heat. That evening, as the sun fell red over the pine trees, a jeep rolled into the yard. A man in a crisp uniform stepped out, an officer from headquarters, his face unreadable. The guard straightened. The prisoners froze. He carried a folder tucked beneath his arm. When he spoke, his voice was sharp enough to cut through the hum of crickets. "Whose idea was this?" he asked. No one answered. He read from a paper, directive from command. Effective immediately, no direct contact between POWs and civilian population. No exchanges, no gifts, no fraternization of any kind. He looked up, eyes narrowing. "You will remember your positions, gentlemen. There are still fences for a reason." Then he turned and walked back to his jeep. The engine started, spitting dust into the fading light. Brown watched it disappear down the road. Around him, the laughter from that morning seemed impossible, like something he'd only imagined. Behind him, Walter stood silent by the fence, his empty bowl still in his hands. The next day, the wire would feel taller again. The guards would stand straighter. And the little girl with the ribbon would not come back. But the taste of that morning, sweet, cold, fleeting, would linger, even after the order came to remind everyone where the lines were drawn. Kindness, it turned out, was more dangerous than escape. The next morning, the camp felt heavier. The laughter from yesterday had vanished, replaced by the scrape of boots and the low rattle of chains. A new order hung on the notice board outside the guardhouse: no contact with civilians. No exchanges. No fraternization. The words were large enough to reach across the yard and shut every mouth. The prisoners lined up for roll call with eyes fixed on the ground. The guards spoke little. The air itself seemed disciplined. Even the cicadas were quiet. Sergeant Tom Brown stood by the gate, arms crossed, watching men who looked more like workers than enemies. He found Captain Reese behind the mess hall, the man's uniform still perfect despite the dust. "Sir," Brown began, careful but firm, "they weren't planning anything. They just made ice cream." Reese didn't turn. "They're still the enemy, Sergeant." Brown's jaw tightened. "Then maybe it's time the war ended for real." Reese looked at him flatly. "It ends when we say so. Not when some farm kids get a taste for German charity." He pointed at the fence. "Keep them in line." Then he walked away, leaving the order fluttering in the wind like an accusation. The day crawled. The men worked without speaking. Franz, usually the loudest, didn't sing. Walter kept looking toward the road where the children used to walk. The wire shimmered under the sun, silent as glass. At dusk, the prisoners gathered near the barracks. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. No one mentioned the rule, but every man felt it. Walter stood slowly, holding the empty metal bowl they'd used for mixing ice cream. Without a word, he walked to the fence and set it down in the dirt, on the exact spot where little Annie had stood the morning before. The guards didn't stop him. They just watched. The bowl caught the fading light and glowed faintly. Minutes passed. Then, from the other side of the wire, a small shadow moved. A child's arm slipped through the fence until the metal pressed against skin. Fingers brushed the rim of the bowl, hesitated, then pulled it gently back through. No one breathed. Then a laugh, quick, soft, unmistakably a child's, drifted through the still air. It was the smallest sound in the world, but it broke the order clean in two. Brown turned away, pretending not to see. He knew what he should do: report it, shout, enforce. But some things didn't belong in reports. He let the silence cover the crime. Later that night, the chaplain added a quiet note to his log: "Unrecorded mercies persist despite directives." When the generator sputtered out after midnight, darkness fell like a blanket. Walter sat with his back to the fence, staring at the gap where the bowl had vanished. "My daughter," he said softly in German, "she'd be about her age now." No one answered. By morning, the notice was still there, but its edges were curling from the dew. The men gathered for work. The world went on pretending that nothing had happened. Then the teleprinter clattered inside the office, a cold, mechanical heartbeat. Brown stepped in to read the strip as it curled from the machine. The words were short, final, printed in deep purple ink: "Movement orders, prepare for repatriation." He read it twice, then looked out the window toward the yard, toward Walter, Franz, the fence, and the empty patch of ground where a child's laughter still seemed to linger. When he stepped outside, Walter caught his eye. "Something's changed," the prisoner said quietly. Brown nodded. "Trucks are coming soon." "How soon?" "A few days." Walter looked toward the road, to the spot where the bowl had disappeared. "Then maybe one more Sunday," he said. Brown didn't answer. He just looked at the sky, already turning white with heat, and thought about fences, how some were made of wire, and some of fear. The teleprinter clicked again inside, sealing the order. Soon, the men who had learned how to make peace from milk and ice would be sent home. But that night, long after the lights went out, the guards found the same old bowl resting at the fence, clean, cold, waiting. Because even when the war was over, kindness still needed somewhere to hide. When the trucks came to take them home, the ice cream machine was still running. September sunlight lay flat over the Alabama fields, bleaching everything it touched: the barracks, the fences, the flags. The camp was quieter than it had ever been. No more songs from the mess tent, no laughter from the yard, just the sound of engines idling and the soft clink of spoons being packed away. Inside the compound, the prisoners stood in formation, bags slung over their shoulders. Their clothes were cleaner now, their faces thinner, their eyes older. A breeze stirred the corn beyond the wire, carrying the faint smell of diesel and sweet milk from the kitchen. The war had ended, but none of them quite knew what peace meant yet. Sergeant Tom Brown walked the line slowly, clipboard in hand, checking names against a list. When he reached Walter Hoffman, the man smiled faintly. His hair had gone silver at the edges. "So," Walter said, "this is it." "Yeah," Brown replied, forcing a small grin. "You finally get to go home." Walter looked toward the open gate, where trucks waited in the sun. "Home," he repeated softly, like a word he hadn't used in years. "Strange. It sounds smaller than I remember." Brown extended his hand. Walter hesitated, then took it, gripping hard. "Thank you," he said. "For the taste of peace." Brown nodded. "Next time, come without the uniform." A laugh escaped both men, short, real, and gone almost instantly. Near the mess hall, Franz and two others were still churning the last batch of ice cream in a battered tin drum. "One more," he said, "for the road." They worked fast, the mixture sloshing under their hands, melting faster than it froze. When it was done, they set the bowl on a wooden table in the open yard. No speeches, no orders, just one final scoop each, shared in silence. The guards joined in quietly. No one spoke of sides anymore. The air was thick with humidity and something else, the ache of parting, the fear of forgetting. A few children from town had gathered beyond the fence, waving shyly. Brown motioned for them to come closer. The captain didn't stop him this time. The smallest boy climbed onto the post and called out, "Mr. Walter." Walter laughed and waved back. "No, mister," he said. "Just Walter now." When the horn sounded, the men began to move toward the trucks. Dust rose in soft clouds around their boots. Some looked back, most didn't. As the convoy started rolling, the ice cream bowl was left on the table, half melted, a pale reflection of the morning sky. Brown watched them go until the last truck disappeared down the road. Then he walked back to the table, lifted the bowl, and found it still cool to the touch. He turned it in his hands for a moment, then set it down again, letting the wind dry the last traces of white at the bottom. A week later, the camp would be dismantled, wires rolled up, towers taken down, signs pulled from the ground. In their place would stand an empty field, a patch of earth where the laughter of enemies had once been possible. 2 years after, in the summer of 1947, a letter arrived from Hamburg. It came addressed simply, Sergeant Tom Brown, Aliceville, USA. The paper was thin, the handwriting neat. "Dear Tom. Every summer, when I give my son ice cream, I tell him that once, an American soldier showed me how peace tastes. I hope he never forgets. I hope neither of us do. Your friend, Walter." Brown kept the letter folded inside his Bible. He never wrote back, though sometimes, on long drives, he found himself whispering the words aloud, the taste of peace. Years passed. The war faded into stories told by men with gray hair and photographs. Children grew up not knowing what wire looked like, or why two men had once stood on opposite sides of it. But somewhere in Alabama, in the town that had hosted strangers, the story lingered, about the day the prisoners made ice cream, and the morning they shared it with children. The locals still called it the sweetest Sunday. When the camp's foundation was finally leveled, one worker found a small bent spoon buried near the place where the fence had been. He turned it over in his hand, smiled, and left it there. Some things weren't meant to be moved. That evening, the sun went down over an empty field, the air still warm, the smell of summer thick and alive. And though the machines were gone, though the fences had rusted into the soil, something invisible remained, a memory of men who learned that mercy doesn't need a flag to exist. Because war has 1,000 ways to kill what's human in a man. But sometimes, one simple taste, cold, sweet, and fleeting, can bring it back.